हो रहा है, हो रहा है, yes. So we can start with a round of introduction. Like, how do you identify as? Uh,
So I identify as a genderqueer trans man, and I am a scientist and activist, and my pronouns are he and they.
so tell us about your story. anything, anything that.
Sure. I mean, somewhat underwhelming story because I have always found it. I'm very bad at concealing things, including about who I am. So when I was in, I think, high school or so, was when I started to identify as queer and trans. Most of the words I used were different at the time. So I think I first identified with words like bisexual, and when I was in school I would just say I'm a boy. So those were the words I used for my gender and sexuality at the time. And so those words have changed a little bit, but the basic idea is the same. Also, it was a school with gendered uniforms, so I wore pants through and shorts for much of school, and so everybody kind of knew that I'm the one who wears pants and shorts or whatever. So in that sense, I was there wasn't quite a coming out story because I was always sort of like this. But and I sort of somewhat naively at that age I thought, well, I'm like this, so I just tell people I'm like this, and then if there are other people like me, they'll find me. Which I now realize in hindsight, in the context of India, was a pretty bad strategy because I think all of the people who I then thought were queer and trans who've now come out, like years, decades later, I think they really kept their distance from me because then associating with me would make them really obvious, right? Because I was out. So, but for that reason, I was therefore quite loud about my identity, thinking, other people will find me. I'm really open about who I am. So anyway, and then I think there was an evolution in terms of how I thought of my gender and sexuality over time, and so I think the sexuality hasn't changed much, except that I realized that I was, what I had thought of as bisexual was very rooted in the idea of a gender binary, and the more I engaged outside of the gender binary, I thought that I realized actually that my interests are largely in people who break the binary. So in fact, I was very much the opposite of bisexual because I'm really not interested in very, very feminine or very masculine men. I'm largely interested in other trans folks or gender non-conforming folks. And so now I just identify as queer that way. And likewise, my notion of thinking of myself as a boy was also very rooted in the idea of the gender binary. In that, even at the time, I would say, well, if one has to be a boy or a girl, then I'm a boy. Those are the options I'm given. But that if and certainly there were ways in which I identified my body as a male body. So to this day, I say I'm a trans man because my relationship with my body is similar to the relationship of any trans man with their body. But but when it comes to gender, I still think of that as, I now think of it much more clearly as a social construct, and I don't want to locate myself in. I don't know. I mean, I find all of the gender boxes created by society just quite arbitrary. Not, I mean, they're oppressive, of course, but also arbitrary. And so I just say I'm genderqueer to sort of locate myself, to just sort of scramble that category. Right? It's also why I prefer genderqueer to non-binary, because non-binary acknowledges the binary and then locates itself outside the binary. And I think that's still too much respect to give the binary. So I just like genderqueer because it's just saying, like, gender itself is queer. Like, the whole thing, the whole notion of gender is very arbitrary. It's culturally specific. It varies from place to place. So I'm genderqueer. And
So, you must know that in few days there is a Father's Day coming.
That's right.
So, what do you think of it? Like, would like to know your opinion on it.
Well, I've always liked the idea of every day being a day to celebrate, like parenthood. rather than specific days, but yeah, it will be my first Father's Day as the parent of a very young child. So that will be it'll be interesting to think of it as a day where the messaging kind of targets people like me, I guess, or people who identify in the way that I do, if not trans parents particularly. And yeah, I remember my own father actually would very often, whenever we see a lot of like pictures of, because I was really interested in wildlife as a kid, so when we see pictures of wildlife of like a parental looking figure with like young animals, it would always be written sort of the mother and two cows, so various things like that. And he would say, why can't it be the father? So I think he, as a cis man, always put in my head the idea that that cis men could be just as much parents as cis women, at least at the time. And certainly, I think that there are various ways in which it's significant to me to be a trans parent, partially because there are so few other folks who I know who are trans parents. A lot of trans men who are parents, and there are many, became parents under conditions of a coercive kind of marriage situation, and didn't get to, unfortunately, choose to parent, even though they, of course, love their kids very much and have done an amazing job parenting them. So certainly it was hard for me to find other trans parents to model, and I think I know a lot more trans women who I feel like I shared with the sort of journey of struggling to become a parent, like really wanting to be a parent, being very intentional about it, finding ways to do this. So yeah, I just want to share the fact that I am a trans parent, so that more trans folks will say, well, there are other people whom I can ask about diaper advice, so whatever else. I mean, these are the things that I thought were a big deal before I became a parent, and then afterwards I was like, well, diapering is actually the easy part. So, yeah.
Okay. So what? So is there any moment, or is there any time when you finally decided that you'll become a transparent parent?
Yeah, I mean, I think I wanted to be a parent very early on in life. So yeah, it may actually stem from my wanting to be an older sibling when I was very, very young, and that not happening. So so I was always sort of fond of babysitting kids and sort of. So I think now, having also been a parent to as part of the chosen family of many trans kids, I think I've been sort of parenting one way or another for many years. Although that was very different, because in those contexts, I was parenting kids who chose me. So in the chosen family, I would not choose to parent kids. Like, we were all kids who came to me saying, I need a parent. I need a parental figure in my life. In fact, my oldest kid, Shivani, when she first came to me, we were only 5 years apart in age. So I was 28 then and she was 23. And her guru had just died, had been killed by her biological family, actually, we think. And so she came to me saying, like, she was my guru, she was my parent, like, I've lost my trans parent and I need another one, like, I needed somebody. So at the time, actually, I was kind of resistant to the idea of like being a parent, because we were friends. So I said, look, I'm your friend, because you still get all the same things from me as a friend as you do. You don't have to make me a parent so that you get more from me. You'll get everything that you need from me just as my friend. And she said, but I don't want a friend, I want a parent. So I said, okay. And and in fact, she had a remarkably supportive biological family, and we actually lived just down the road from them. And they were really wonderful parents to her, in the sense that, unlike with a lot of trans women, they were just, as a visibly trans person in the area, she was welcomed, accepted, and so on. And her parents, but they could not parent her through her transition. She wanted that. She wanted a slightly older trans person to kind of parent her through the transition. Her own guru was also very close to her age. So It wasn't a traditional parenting relationship in that sense either, but she wanted someone she could live with, who was a parental figure, not a, where she could sort of safely dress the way she wanted to in the house and so on. And she wanted all of these things very specifically, and so she very much designed what that relationship looked like. And then, so I think after that, we had several more kids in the family, and in all cases, they were the ones who decided everything. So it's very strange to be parenting an infant, because although my baby has very, very, like, they'll communicate something very clearly, like, I don't want to wear clothes ever, or I don't want to eat this, or so they communicate no and disinterest very quickly. And they'll also, when they like something, that's very clear. So even though there's non-verbal, some things are very clear, but lots of other things are not clear. And the first time I'm really imposing myself as a parent on another human being, vaccinations, right? I mean, obviously, they don't want to be vaccinated, and I still vaccinate them. They don't want to wear clothes, which in the summer I can let them run around nanga, but like in winter, I had to clothe them in warm clothes which they hated. So, it's the first time I'm really imposing my will on another human being, and it's a very strange, that part of it's a very strange experience. But it makes me think a lot about agency and what it looks like. And also, people think of the notion of consent as a very adult, sex-specific conversation, but I mean, I realize with kids that it's really not, because when my kid plays with other kids, they're negotiating consent in terms of just like basic touch, right? Like they touch, like somebody touches my kid on the arm, and sometimes they like it, and sometimes they really don't like it. And my kid also, meanwhile, doesn't know how to touch other kids, right? It doesn't know what kind of touch other kids like and don't like. So I actually am realizing the notion of consent is something that kids are thinking about at a just not of non-sexual touch, just of like interaction. It's something that they're thinking about at a very, very early age, as soon as they're socializing with other kids. But they're confused. Like you see them being confused about what other kids want, and you see them like sometimes learning about themselves. Like I like this kind of touch, and I don't like that kind of touch. So because like my kid is the younger one in their cohort, and so there's a lot of slightly older kids who like come to give them lots of hugs and kisses and so on, and like, my kid is just like, what is this? Like spotting them all the way a lot of the time. And so yeah, so I'm realizing that it's a conversation to have actually very early on, to get kids thinking like about, do they like this? Do you think they like this? How do you pick up on whether they like this? Like that, I think, is something that kids are already thinking about in their very. And I think it will lay the foundation for thinking of consent very differently as adults. So things like that I'm thinking about, which I didn't think parenthood would make me think about. There's surprises at every step.
So how is your experience until now, having a kid in the house?
Really, really just blissful. That I know people really emphasize how difficult parenthood is and how like not blissful it can be at times, and it can be, I think, especially early on when one's scared and frustrated, like it can be quite overwhelming. But just I think before this I had become somewhat of a workaholic, because I had just I had just forgotten, especially after coming to India. In India, the activist scene is just really still very dominated by a very almost Brahminical Gandhianness, right? Where we like deny ourselves sort of all kinds of pleasures of life, and like we're living very monastic lives almost. So I think I had just forgotten what it meant to have sort of. So I had just become a workaholic. I was just constantly working all the time, and I think this is the first time in my life that I have like something that's just instantly rewarding, like as a way to spend time every day. So now when I'm in the office, I'm working because I want to finish it and I want to go home and I want to just chill out with my kid. And it's very nice. It's just like incredible having that. Just knowing that. And so sometimes, I'll have all kind, bouts of depression for a whole bunch of reasons. And then I think I'll just go home and meet my kid, and it just all goes away. So they're just incredible as just a source of good cheer and surprises and constant entertainment. Yeah, and they've also taught me, like, when I'm with them, if my brain is on work or anything, I'm not enjoying myself. But as soon as my brain, my attention is 100% on them, it's just fantastic. So yeah.
So, you were saying about that thing, no? When you went to your mother and said, ki, so can you talk about it again?
So again, when I went to my mother and said, oh, when I was a kid,
Yeah.
Yeah, when I was a kid, I requested a sibling. And I asked my mom, please make one and let me know when it's done. And she said, no, it's not happening. And I was sort of like, well, I mean, I think that you don't have complete control over this, right? Some people just have siblings. And I thought that sometimes it just happens, and I was like, no. So yeah. So at the time I sort of was glad that she hadn't given me false hope, but at the same time, I think I've been on the lookout for small people to parent ever since then. We've been in the process of helping other trans people and just like more working class couples adopt. I think we've been particularly worried about the ways in which class may figure into the system, but the ways in which judgments are made about doing home study reports and so on. And so I think that, but we're still in the process of actually trying to see how this works out, and you know. So I think in general there is a worry that the adoptive system is not inclusive enough, and also there aren't, bizarrely in India there are not a lot of kids in the adoptive system. We know that the number of kids who don't have parents is much larger than this, but there's a lot of formal adoption. There's a lot of kids who go into various kinds of institutional care without coming into the adoption. So there are lots of changes to be made. Intersex kids, for example, get classified as children with disabilities. And I mean, not that, so and then often the perspective in placing them is to place them with parents who are rich enough to give them corrective surgery. It's assumed that the corrective surgery imposed on an intersex child is part of what is necessary for them. So there are a lot of ways in which I think the adoption system, we need to together sort of change things. But otherwise, in many ways, it's a fairly straightforward and transparent and accessible process. Anyone can go to the kara.net.in website and sign up, and there's a good, community on Facebook and email of adoptive parents who can also guide one through the journey, and I'm certainly happy to help advise anyone who wants to go through that. Yeah, so I would just recommend a formal adoption over, and I would really, even though there may be issues with the intricacies of sort of the formal adoption system through CARA, I would really recommend people to go through that, because I think the informal processes that people who adopt will often leave a lot of loopholes in terms of the safety of the child, and therefore I think especially for trans folks it's important to make sure that the adoption is as solid as it can be. I would really recommend that people go through the CARA system.
So is there any advice or suggestions for people who actually are from the community and would like to adopt in the coming time?
Yeah. So I would say, I'd say in any case, whenever one wants a child, one wants to make sure that there is some relative kind of financial independence from any of the structures that may obstruct one from being fully and openly trans. So that's an important thing to set up. And I think that, as I said, that I would like to make sure that the important thing in the adoption process is kind of the sort of regularity of income rather than the quantity of income. I still worry about it being a classist process. But so we'll work on that and make sense of that way. But but yeah, I just I think that the only other thing that one should do um, is that for me at least, I put in a lot of work on myself before I parented. Even though I wanted to be a parent for a very, very long time, I agonized about what a kid might want in a parent and ways in which I might fall short of that for a while before. And that's the only thing I would recommend that everybody do. To really think about what would be best for a kid, and what are the ways in which I would need to change myself to be ready. And I think that's the only advice I would say. Go for it. Go through a formal process. If support is needed, I'm happy to provide support to any person in the community who wants to. And I think that that we have to make the formal system work rather than use informal means. And and that a lot of parenting the parenting process is entirely about the kid. So even though many of us have very strong desires to be parents, it fundamentally can't be driven by that, and it has to be driven by, we know that our desire to be good parents is like 90% of what it takes. Like with everything, I think the interest to do something is 90% of what it takes to do it well. But then one has to always think about the remaining 10%, which is what are the things that interest should drive, so that you're fully prepared for the kids before, to the extent that you can be.